CPERN. Hi, welcome to the CPERN online workshop on the critical political economy of climate protests. And we have a very exciting paper today. It's going to be presented by one of the authors of the paper, Oscar Berglund from Bristol University. And so the way it works is we're going to have a presentation of about 10, 12 minutes from Oscar, and then Louisa Parks and Laurence Cox have kindly agreed to act as discussants of the paper. So we'll proceed then for the discussants points and questions, and then we'll open it up to the rest. And so hopefully the idea of this type of workshops is also to be a kind of supportive environment where we can all of us kind of participate and get food for thought as well on the paper that's being presented. So thank you, Oscar, for agreeing, and thank you, Louisa and Laurence as well for agreeing to be discussants. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Basically, when Bernd asked me to do this, I was a little bit, I was honored and also a little bit perplexed because this paper isn't really a paper. Like, it's not a research paper. It's a comment piece in Nature, which was a big deal to be published in Nature as any kind of social scientist, and particularly as a critical political economist and study protest. But it's not a research piece. Basically, we're kind of setting out from our perspectives a little bit about what could be done, what ought to be done in researching climate protests. So I put some slides together to talk to you guys today. And by you, I mean, for me, this is kind of my intellectual, political, intellectual academic community, critical political economy. It's where I came from. It's, my first, I believe Monica and Louisa and David were at the first ever academic thing that I ever participated in 2014. Laurence, very much one of the first kind of scholars that I engaged with when I was doing intellectually, when I was trying to study social movements from a kind of Marxist perspective when I was doing my PhD. So it's very nice to, I think this is the first time we're actually in a Zoom call together. So really here, so first I thought I'd set out what we kind of tried to do with this Nature article, and then thinking about what it means to study climate activism from a kind of critical political economy perspective, and what our role might be in doing that. So we basically in this article set out three kind of themes of what we know about these topics and what we ought to be doing. And one of them is the question that came mainly from Dana, who is somebody who's been studying climate activism from a kind of US social movements perspective, from a social movement studies perspective and sociology perspective for many years. Is what motivates some people to join protests while others don't. That's arguably the key question of the whole field of social movement studies. I'd say why protests happen and why people join them. So that's very much where she comes from, doing surveys and so on at major protests that she's done for many years. Then what are the pros and cons of the tactics that protesters use? So this is where I've been working quite a bit with. Obviously my kind of research has always been about civil disobedience and the role about civil disobedience, first in housing protests in Spain, and then as the climate protests started in the UK in when it's not started, but when they went big in the UK in 2019, then why do they use civil disobedience, and what role does that play? And then I started working with Colin Davis, who's the other author on this article, who's a cognitive psychologist whose research had nothing to do with climate protest until he became a climate protester himself, and then has kind of became more and more gone into this, and I think his political thinking also has become more and more kind of radical with the years, and which is the case for a lot of people, basically. So I'll come to that. But this has become the pros and cons of different tactics, and particularly the role of these kind of more, disruptive protests and often quite small scale protests have become really, there's a lot of people that have become interested in this, and not least because of, one of our colleagues in CPERN, Laura Horn, has become a really leading activist in Scientist Rebellion in Europe, and there's a lot of other people that have become really active on the activist front, and therefore try to understand more about it. So it has become a really interdisciplinary topic, not least because so many people have become activists kind of themselves through these groups like Extinction Rebellion. So you get asked to review things in like economics journals and things like that, and all kinds of different kind of publications that publish about these things, and using a lot of methods that we perhaps would see as a bit odd to try to measure effects of protests and so on. Traditionally, perhaps this question about why you would use different kinds of tactics has been studied a lot in political theory from various lenses, kind of more liberal lenses and some more radical ones, and more anarchist stuff, certainly, that I studied a lot. You also have this strand of research of US civil resistance kind of research that has its particular quite a theoretical bend with Gene Sharp, and then followed by Erica Chenoweth, and so on, in recent decades. And that stuff has been quite quantitative, and then you have what we do, which is more kind of critical political economy, where we try to bring in okay, but what about capitalism in all this, and what are the links, and so on. And then David also, of course, and with Monica and others that are part of CPERN have studied the role of protest more broadly in different kind of protests and how it's increased, but then also increasingly turned their view to, and by David particularly, towards climate protests and the limits and possibilities of it. So that's kind of the in terms of the tactics, that's I think a lot of research is taking place in that space. And then what was really important to me and to Colin, I think, was to, okay, but we need to say, we have this opportunity to write something in Nature, so we need to put in something about the repression of protest that is going on. And they let us do that. So within, toned down in the language that we were allowed to use, but that's certainly where my kind of research is now turning as well. I'm trying to get money to study the criminalization of protest in a kind of international comparative perspective. Because a lot of protesters obviously are feeling it. I mean, not least in the UK in its certain forms, but obviously this is something that we were small talking earlier about the different clampdowns on protest and academic freedom that goes on in the US, particularly in very Republican states. And in Australia, there's been a lot of criminalization of protest, and in various countries. I think I read today that in Germany there's been proscribing Letzte Generation as like basically an illegal group, and so on. And that's obviously the kind of one kind of criminalization of protest, but then obviously in many other countries for a very long time, it's been you risk your life if you are so an environmental protector or climate activist, and that's what our research project kind of tries to build the links there. So then I was thinking about, what's our contribution as critical political economists in studying these protests. So, what distinguishes us? Well, we try to understand capitalism and its obstacles to climate action and democracy. We often therefore look at a lot of actors that don't do that as somewhat naive and maybe misguided in some sense. We see revolutionary agency from below as the only real means of kind of transcending capitalism, and then therefore in this respect saving civilization, if that's what's under threat according to the IPCC report. So we try to understand that agency, and I think that's where CPERN has been a really valuable space for me and us in doing that, right? Because it's where those kind of things, because even a lot of other in critical IP don't necessarily study social movements in the way that there's been a real space in CPERN to do. So that's why I've really appreciated that space. So what does that mean what does that mean for what our contribution is towards this kind of then growing interest, perhaps right now mainly in academia, as in there's in academia, and there's a growing interest in this because so many people are getting involved in it. Apart from that, the kind of numbers involved in climate activism right now doesn't seem to be huge. Certainly seems to be lower than it was in 2019. But there is a growing academic interest in it. But in a way, obviously a lot of us are Gramscians in one way or another, and have fantasized about being an organic intellectual of some kind for decades. And it is a chance to do that, right? And it is a chance to help people that are involved in struggles to think more about what is the kind of thinking that it's our role, I think, to help people with. It's to explore capitalism, explore the links between the states, market, social forces, and climate destruction that we're involved with fighting, and understand, the political organizing from below is the only hope in doing so. Also, understand that the climate crisis is linked to a bunch of other crises that have come to be termed kind of polycrisis in a lot of the literature, and therefore that we need to kind of build alliances across struggles. And in terms of where we do this, and where, like, basically in the last couple of months, I was invited on a panel with Julia Steinberger and a couple of others to speak at a big 400 climate scientists conference in Vienna about, should we do more than just produce research? Where we talked about these things, and I was invited to this Amsterdam Complexity School of Climate Science. That was really cool space where they a lot of different interdisciplinary young academics got together to talk about. Well, this was part of it, the sort of activist link, and they're all, my message and kind of Julia's message in all of this is, like, right now, obviously, to link Palestine and to link the anti-genocide politics with the climate struggle, and with climate activism, and treat this as one and the same struggle, and bring them together, and that that building those kind of alliances is obviously really important, and understanding this as a kind of class politics. So that's, I think, what the role of us as critical political economists is in contributing to this kind of wider scholarships and politics. I mean, I think a lot of us are in it for the politics, right? That's what we ultimately want to do. So I might stop there. I can then also made a bunch of slides on the specific research that we have done recently with Colin over the last year about Just Stop Oil, and where we kind of have tried to really dig into these questions about, is this kind of protest like counterproductive? Like, what does it actually achieve? And we did lots of different research about that we interviewed people, we interviewed policymakers, we did big opinion polls, like surveys through YouGov and stuff. where we looked at issues about, banning new oil and gas licenses, public opinion around it, the unpopularity of Just Stop Oil and civil disobedience, the criminalization of protests, public opinion on criminalization of protests, and media reporting. And we basically came to the quite, not necessarily surprising, but, depressing a little bit findings that obviously Just Stop Oil haven't really achieved very much. They haven't been counterproductive as such, but they haven't really been that productive either. They haven't, apart from, they have raised the salience of the issue of new oil and gas licenses, but they didn't really shift any public opinion or any concern about climate change, and certainly haven't drawn lots of people into the movement, which has always been the kind of critique of the likes of Laurence and me more cautiously, I think, against these movements, that they are not going to be good at doing that. So, it has been little sign of influence of larger kind of influencing. And while they have, one interesting finding that we find in this project is that the kind of media that's write the most about Just Stop Oil is basically the Daily Mail, and particularly the Mail Online. So it becomes a kind of right-wing hatred clickbait thing. So it becomes increasingly difficult for, which we have here in sort of mean quote lengths and so on, increasingly difficult for activists to get their own message across, that it's they get in the media but not in the right way, and perhaps they have been more influential in allowing the state to legitimize the criminalization of protest than they have done in terms of stopping oil and gas licenses being passed. So obviously I wouldn't call that as being their fault that they're being criminalized, but that's kind of been the politics that they have been weaponized by the government in doing. So that's briefly about our findings in that project, and I'm going to leave it there and see what Laurence and Louisa have to say about what I've said.
Thank you, Oscar. So if you're okay, shall we proceed with Louisa first and then Laurence, if that's okay with you guys? Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Sorry. The years pass and my ability to unmute myself never seems to improve. So sorry about that. Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the chance to speak about this subject. It's really nice to be here with all of you. It's been quite a while. I'd forgotten about that one in 2014, Oscar. So that's a really nice reminder. Thanks. Okay, so I've made probably far too many notes, but I'll just try and sort of, I guess, try and comment a little bit on what you were saying on the basis of things that I've been trying to think through myself recently in terms of, impacts of activism, whether we need to be so worried about how we measure them, whether impact has anything to do with the imaginaries of activists involved in the activism itself. These are all questions that I think are, quite genuine questions that I'm interested to hear what others are thinking about as well. So I guess the first thought is about sort of how we're understanding where we are, I guess, in a cycle of climate activism, which, and of course, ideas of cycles of contention are very, very broad, very generalist. They never really describe exactly what a particular social movement looks like. And I think that's very much true with kind of climate protests peaking around 2019, but then maybe tailing off mostly because of the pandemic, but also the sort of contemporary, simultaneous use of civil disobedience, etc., maybe because of the, emotions that go with climate protest of, frustration and feeling hopeless and feeling, really quite angry and very anxious a lot of the time. And that this sense of urgency kind of pushes towards a certain kind of action. What I found really interesting in what you said, and also the article that I read, and also your article with David, which does such a lovely job of kind of organizing the thought around the different imaginaries kind of post-capitalism that are coming out of this activism, is the idea that it's very hard to measure the long-term impact of climate activism if we understand it as a broad and very, very complex network of collective action, right? So like you say in your article, if we look beyond the sort of internal differences, if we try to look at that movement as quite far off, as a distant object, let's say, we see lots of different kinds of groups who are making what might look like similar claims if we're just looking at sort of protest slogans or even Mail Online articles, right? We might not see those more nuanced differences within that movement. So when we think of broader impact, we tend to talk about a whole movement across a whole cycle of contention. And that's where I think you said this nicely in the Nature article, we can't imagine a transformation without there having been a major movement. And I think you used the example of the suffragettes, but was it just the suffragettes? Is it also the suffragists who are, a little bit less, not throwing themselves in front of the king's horse so much, etc.? We tend to, so what are the impacts of the whole shebang, I guess, is what I would like to pose to the group, I guess. So if we look beyond Just Stop Oil or Last Generation or other civil disobedience groups, how can we think about their place within a much broader kind of network of action that might be pushing those kinds of cultural changes that we need? Because another thing that kind of comes out of your work more generally, I think, is the suggestion, and I completely agree, is that if we look at a certain a campaign or a single group or somebody pushing for a quite specific kind of change, we can prove that sometimes. We can show where the impact was. We can measure it like a good social scientist would try to do, right? But that's not the impact that really matters, right? And you say this very clearly, big transformational change, changing our systems, changing our economic governance systems, changing the assumptions that our institutions are built on, which, build into this kind of polycrisis, patriarchy and, accumulation and logics of destruction, all of this stuff sort of departs from the same logics that lead to capitalism. So if we can measure impact nicely, or the lack of impact nicely, it's usually campaigns that aren't the ones that are really going to change things. We tend to see the changes when we look back across history, right? And we can look back at the civil rights movement, etc., and say, yeah, it's really hard to imagine that that change would have happened if that movement wasn't there. So how do we grapple with this? Should we be worrying so much about impact, I guess, when we're in the middle of it, I guess, is a question that I would ask. And I say that as somebody who really tries to work out what impacts are while the movement is going on. So it's also a self question in that sort of sense. I also, thinking about the idea, I guess the ideas or imaginaries or discourses about where activists are with respect to capitalism that you look at as well, which I find very interesting. Also because recently did some work around that very question amongst people marching on different days around the pre-COP in Milan, which was just before the Glasgow climate COP a couple of years back. So about the same time you guys were probably writing that article, I guess. And finding quite similar things in that, you know, the people who were marching were all saying that we want system change, but then when you go and interview and you look a little bit more in depth, what the system, whatever the system is, should be replaced by looks very different for different people. But one thing that we found that I'd be interested to hear your comment on was that a lot of the talk was not so much about what we should do about capitalism now, but about where do we disagree about what this looks like afterwards. So we framed it as sort of, you know, what do people mean when they talk about climate justice? And the ideas that came out were very different, but they were less about the critique of what was now. That seemed almost a given that we don't want this, but what do we want? So I guess my next sort of question or general idea would be, if we're looking at the movement as a network and we're looking at it culturally across time, how important is it that there are different imaginaries of what comes after the system change? And how does that matter in terms of imaginaries about how you make decisions about what that future looks like? Because, you know, I think we all have sort of questions and maybe some healthy skepticism about ideas like citizens' assemblies, or how do we scale up from community creation of different kinds, right? And that's another thing that you discuss in your work. But is the act of just trying to build a decision-making system that tries to be more collective and more inclusive an important part of the imaginary that we're overlooking, rather than the sort of more content-based? And there, I think there's work by ecofeminist scholars like Sherilyn McGregor, who have made, I think, a very important point, which is that a lot of the work on community creation, for example, on sustainable materialism, also on citizens' assemblies and ways of sort of thinking through deep ecology, etc., owe quite a lot to the scholarship around things like ecofeminism, different understandings of interpersonal, but also amongst human and beyond human caring relationships, also bring a lot of attention to how is labor divided and rewarded within those kinds of imaginaries as well, which often don't get a lot of shrift in some other kinds of work. So that would be another question. And a question I'd bring myself in myself there is also whether we have a problem of being overly, I don't know how to put it. Always comes out a bit strangely. I mean, how do we imagine traditional ecological knowledge in this, right? So movements asking for different governance systems that have been, you know, quite successful in pushing things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which talks a lot to ideas of inclusion, particularly around environmental decision-making, which talks a lot to problems about how we understand property, how we understand land tenure, how we understand access to land, access to seeds, access to intellectual property, all of these debates that are coming from struggles elsewhere in the world and particularly in Latin America. And then I guess my final thing, because I know I've been talking for too long, is obviously the repression side, which is a big problem in Europe right now. A couple of hours ago, Last Generation in Germany has been, they've arrested, I think, 5 organizers, accusing it of being a criminal organization. That came out in The Guardian about 2:30 this afternoon, so I haven't really digested it yet. But I think, yeah, it can be difficult to know. I find it difficult to know how to think about what to do, or how academics can say something about repression. But one really important thing, I think, small but important, is avoiding saying that there is some kind of inevitability about civil disobedience turning into political violence in some way. Because I think we have, certain kinds of theories that we've shown for a long time to be quite nuanced, right? That there isn't this sort of bifurcation at the end of a protest wave where you either turn into an NGO or you become a sort of politically violent organization. We know that there's a lot more variety than that. And we also know that movements don't just disappear, they change, right? The people change into other sort of forms of activism or different causes, but they don't sort of just either tail off into nothing via repression or get pushed underground into something very dangerous via repression. There are all kinds of things that might happen there. So I think one really small thing that we can do is, if we're ever getting interviewed or everything like that, is say, look, it's really complicated. And it's not that somebody glues themselves to the street that the next day they're going to do whatever. This is not how this stuff happens, right? So that would be just one thing. And the other one, I guess, would be a question, which is about something that, is there somebody or something, or perhaps, big oil or carbon majors that are pushing for this kind of repression? And I don't know, obviously, but I would also have a hunch for good old institutional inertia and the sort of long-studied phenomenon that movements that are seen as more left-wing are more heavily repressed than movements that are seen as more right-wing. So I wonder if it's just a question of the system defending itself and its role in capitalism, which is another point you very rightly raise in your paper. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louisa. So we'll proceed with Laurence next. Thank you.
Okay, is the sound okay there? Good. So, Oscar, I mean, congratulations on getting anything into Nature. That's a big step forward for the field. And the article with David, I mean, it might be good. I think it's open access. You can maybe share the link in the chat. I've shared it with people on the kind of activist training I'll be doing shortly, because it is actually very useful in framing stuff. It's a very nice piece. Let me start with a disclaimer. My objection to Halamite politics has nothing to do with it being about civil disobedience. It's a politics of look at me, and B, because it's a crap strategy. When it fails, people don't know that there's anything else, and they just demobilize rather than doing something better, whether of a civil disobedience nature or otherwise. So it's that, fundamental self-centered strategy, which I think does have something to do with it coming from particularly a sort of Southern England context, which is largely a social movement desert, where most people's, in my experience of engaging with people in early XR around Stroud, most people had no concrete lived experience of mass movements that were capable of shifting anything. They had at best caricatures of Martin Luther King or whoever. So there is a real problem when people are in that situation, and it's generational, it's geographic, but the difficulty that the Anglophone media then presented this as a very central form of climate struggle, while ignoring, for example, relatively effective forms of indigenous opposition to fossil fuel extraction and transport, which have been much more confrontational, much more effective, with far smaller numbers of poorer people facing much heavier repression, and have been largely ignored in this debate, but don't deserve it. That attention is purely and simply a factor of who is centered in Halamite politics, which is the kind of people who become journalists, who become academics, and who are Anglophone. There is a real hall of mirrors phenomenon there with Halamism. That's by the by, but it kind of needs to be said, because so much attention gets taken up as though this is representative of anything at all other than itself, and I don't think it is. It is the weatherman of climate activism, is Halamism. So I wanted to ask a slightly different question. This is coming from a Marxist perspective, but maybe a more historical one, more international one, and bringing in particularly the study of revolutions, which Marxists try to bring in with the study of social movements rather than happening somewhere else. And it's around the question of what do we know of what has worked at scale, not for regime change in the rather narrow American sense, but to actually bring about substantial changes in the mode of production, or let's say from one form of capitalism to another. When have we seen that happen? What can we say about the modes of agency that are capable of doing that? The thing that's increasingly grabbed my attention is decolonization in Asia and Africa. Decolonization, the end of empire in Asia in the 1940s and 1950s, is probably the single biggest change from below in terms of the numbers of people affected that human beings have ever achieved. Given that 60% of our species is Asian. So even leaving aside Africa, it's very, very significant. And it tells us not about the end of capitalism, but certainly about the end of empire, about shifts from one form of capitalism to another, very often to different forms of import substitution, for example, national developmentalist states and so on. And one of the really interesting things you see when you look at that is that there was no one magic path to independence from empire. There was, you could say stereotypically, an Indian path and a Chinese path. But actually there were many, many different paths, which I think is quite a hopeful thing. Particularly, if you look at Roger Hallam or whatever and think, dear God, are we dependent on that to win? It's actually to see that no, we're not. That there were a number of effective routes to independence from empire, as well as unexpected events like Japanese invasion of much of colonized Asia in the early 1940s, and cascading successes where empires which had been defeated in one context gave up more quickly in other contexts, didn't contest it. So less of a methodologically nationalist approach than the sort of Chenoweth idea might give us. I think there are probably two things that are worth saying about those. One is that underpinning the successful overthrowing of empire is usually quite long-running processes of alliance building. And Indian subaltern studies is absolutely fascinating on this. The number of different mad things that go into getting rid of an empire. It is not simple, it is not linear, it is not nice and quantitative and tick, 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 tick. but with, of course, very different competing strategies, often within individual movements, within those alliance processes, and the question of who would win out eventually, very often not clear until quite late in the process. The other thing I would say more generally, I suppose, and stepping back into the more general Marxist account of revolutions, of what we know about what actually brings about substantial change in systems, is the construction of dual power institutions, which refers us then again back to that level of quite deep organization, not necessarily organizing in the American sense of organizing versus activism, but the reorganizing of relatively substantial areas of daily labor, paid, unpaid, peasant labor, and so on and so forth. Very substantial social institutions over time, and in contestation with states, landlords, fascist thugs, police forces, and so on. Now, giving that contrasting suggestion, doesn't, I think, it's not an alternative to this way of thinking about things, but perhaps there's a question about the relationship between people's imaginary, particularly when it's people who are imagining something they've never done. They're in a state where this hasn't happened within living memory, perhaps. It's quite theoretical. And how people come to the point, which is often the case in revolutions, that they do something that they haven't imagined. Because one other thing that we really strongly know from the history of revolutions is relatively rarely is there actually a vanguard party that makes the revolution. It happens, but much more commonly, large numbers of people radicalize as they get involved. And the parties that win out are not the parties that start the process. So, here we're talking about movement organizations rather than parties, but I think the point is relevant. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laurence, as well. So we can maybe collect some more questions or points from the audience, and then we can finish the session with Oscar kind of responding broadly to all the points that have been taken. So if people want to put their hands up, then I can try. Maybe not do it all at once, please. Is that the hand, Julia?
Yes, thank you, and sorry for being late. I've already, I think, sent my apologies. I'm really glad that we're having this session. And thank you, Oscar, for this important work that you're doing. And I want to second Laurence saying, well done on getting something into nature, because it shows us that it's possible if you try. It can be possible, which I think is also quite hopeful and symbolic when we talk about the movements that you are discussing, right, in your work. And to that end, because a lot of the work that I do has to do with things that tend to be less hopeful. I want to ask you to perhaps elaborate on these sort of possibilities and deficiencies of the movements. I think it's very important to see where their limitations are, what kind of tactics are being instrumentalized, what is effective, what isn't, not least so that learning from the mistakes can be made. So do you see that it is possible to bridge this gap that exists between sort of upper middle class kids who are really upset that they can't fly to Bali guilt-free anymore, and people who have their family drowning and their crops burning? Do you think that within the next, say, 10 years, it's possible to build those alliances? Because there are more and more movements around the world, like, of what you've been observing in the UK specifically. I know you've been involved quite a lot with these narratives. Kind of, do you think there are shifts happening? Like, if you could could tell us. And I'm really curious to know kind of where those hopes are and what we can do in our academic and activist work, talk with our students, with our colleagues, to push towards those changes. Maybe we should ourselves join some alliances or promote certain things. So I think that could be really useful to us and to those who will be watching this recording later. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So we'll try and collect some other contributions. Was that a hand, David, or were you just... Okay, go for it.
I
then.
wasn't just waiting. Yeah, thanks.
I thought you were fighting a fly or something, so...
No, thanks. It's really just, I mean, I agree with Yulia. It's really excellent to have this conversation, and it's been really thought-provoking and help us to sort of channel the question of what are we actually doing when we're trying to study kind of climate change, social movements, but I guess social movements more generally as well. So thanks to all the speakers. I mean, I think yeah, Louisa really helped to think about that question of do we really want to be focusing on consequences of social movements? Because I think that's a really nice way of highlighting a risk of doing that, which is that you get bogged down in the detail and you miss the actual macro social change, which you could perhaps only see retrospectively. So I think I just wanted to say that I appreciated that point, and I think it's probably right. And I think just going back to the initial observation that Oscar made about this kind of challenge of trying to think of trying to think and talk and study social movements, but to have capitalism in your mind at the same time, and which also Laurence obviously talked about. And I think that's helpful as well to think about it in terms of we haven't got obviously examples of the eradication of global capitalism to study to help us to guide our project of eradicating global capitalism, but we have got instances of decolonization, which perhaps actually is a richer empirical source to help us to think that through. So I appreciated that as well. But I think my main question is it's still difficult. It still feels difficult. Well, it's not really a question. It's more like a complaint about the way the world is. It still feels difficult to do both of those things at once, to have like an empirical study of what are actual climate movements doing without it getting too bogged down in that kind of overly empirical detailed kind of issue, and the more general question of like how are we actually understanding this as an aspect of capitalism. Because I don't know, I think it still is a challenge, however much we try to resolve that challenge of you either end up with a very systemic level depiction of processes that are happening that don't seem to really provide much capacity for the agency of climate movements, or if you try to bring the climate movements into your focus, you end up I think unavoidably with what you're saying, Louisa, which is a kind of a bit of an overly empiricist and overly focused on did it work or didn't it work, and that can be problematic because it's never that linear. So I guess it's just it's just really kind of a reflection on the good way in which you each spoke to each other, and the fundamental frustrations there, I think, which is that it's difficult to do that challenge. So thanks for encouraging us to continue trying.
Thank you. Do we have any others they want to contribute? Well, if not, I'll jump in. I just don't want to abuse my position as chair. Well, first, joining in the congratulations from everyone. I think it's actually really important piece, and it's also very important that it has been published in Nature in order to get that kind of debate started. I want to pick up on two things kind of connected with the article, but also that Louisa and Laurence have mentioned. I think it's something that matters quite a lot. When reading the article, there is a tension, I think, that happens a lot within social movement scholarship, and it's almost a tension that's inevitable in all of us because it becomes a difficulty, which is that element of trying to avoid, but almost not able to avoid, the kind of behavioralist impetus towards trying to identify people's motivations or why. So basically kind of goes into an element of individualistic motivations for activism or the changes that it might have within those concrete activists. And, you know, I'm saying it as a tension, not necessarily as a criticism, because also at the end of the day, there is elements in which that has to be done. You know, it's kind of mainstream social science at the end of the day that we also have to get engaged with. And those are kind of some of the questions that they ask. But it becomes a tension for us. It doesn't become a tension for the behavioralists. You know, that's fine. It becomes a tension for us because you're doing it at the same time as being aware that perhaps doesn't bring anything that's that useful, except knowing particular individual kind of motivations or behaviors. And so I think the 2 points that Louisa and Laurence made that can be very useful in terms of kind of navigating through that tension. And one of them is, you know, Louisa mentioned the ecofeminist perspective on kind of community creation. And I think some of those, which are actually the processes that end up creating the subjectivization within a movement that goes beyond that kind of individual motivation type of discourse, can become very useful. And I think it's worth connecting it with Laurence's idea of that construction of dual power, because at the end of the day, that community creation, that construction of community creation is part of that dual power in a way. So I suppose what I'm trying to say rather than a question is to try and see how we can incorporate some of those elements. And I'm thinking particularly with the experience in Catalonia that we've had over the years, but particularly now in Girona City Council, how some of that dual power might be able to be created within the municipal level. Right? So how those social movements at that municipal level can, in a way, kind of contest the state, can contest other elements that can be more long-lasting in a way than an individual's motivations or behaviors at any particular point of a demonstration. And then connecting it with repression, because again, when we think of repression, we tend to think of repression often as kind of an individual outcome. So someone gets arrested, someone goes to prison, someone gets a trial. But repression can also be, well, it is always collective. It's never one person, it's the whole movement gets repressed, but also those dual power institutions get repressed. We see, for example, in terms of the EU and funding of municipalities, how it can be linked and connected to certain elements. So perhaps encouraging as well to think of repression beyond the kind of police baton, which matters, but repression as part of that more general criminalization of any kind of transformative element within society. And repression can also be a mobilizing tool. You know, actually, we can see throughout history that anti-repressive struggles become huge motivators in anti-systemic elements. So I think sometimes movements can be more effective in changing the system in a way, or at least creating that subjectivity that's anti-systemic, when they're able to mobilize that anti-repressive aspect, because it means that someone has become more aware of what the system actually is. And once the system hits you, it becomes kind of far more real in a way. But anyway, just a general kind of trying to wrap it up. And the floor is yours, Oscar, to finish us off.
To respond to all of these points raised over the last half an hour. Yeah, I'm not even going to try. I don't disagree with anything that any of you say, really. I mean, yeah, like, I think agree with David about the importance of what you're saying, Louisa. Yeah, like, and I think we get pushed into, and obviously that's something that happens to me because I get asked, because I end up doing quite a lot of media early on, and then like you get asked like, isn't this like counterproductive? And then you kind of need to, so that kind of pushed me into, well, is there any way, and that's what this research project last year about Just Stop Oil was, is there any way that you can say that it's counterproductive? And then you kind of get pushed into these like, and I mean, one slide that I often have when I talk about this is like, just because it's measurable, it doesn't mean that it's important, right? And like, that's like, I mean, but still I end up trying to measure things that are measurable, but in combination with other things, obviously. So to be honest, I think this kind of conversation is important for like kind of continual soul searching as academics, and what's the important things that you do. But tomorrow, Colin and I are going to speak at the encampment at University of Bristol at 3 o'clock. So that's an important talk as well. So and Colin was interviewed in the by the Guardian when the encampment was brand new, and was basically slagging off the university for our extreme links to the arms trade. As Bristol is a city of the arms trade. So I think it's and obviously all this what you're saying, Laurence, about studying these the historical revolutions, absolutely. And I mean, people want to know this, right? There's a hunger for knowing what works, and really that, and I think a lot of people are interested in that kind of things. Obviously, one researcher can't be dedicated to all of these things, so it's good if we talk to each other and learn from each other. I mean, I've always been into dual power, and in a way, dual power is when I started reading about the whole prefiguration stuff, the prefiguration literature kind of, before it became anarchist, was a kind of Gramscian study of like dual power in the kind of local municipality things that you're talking about, Monica, but like in like the 60s or 70s or whatever. So yeah, I mean, like, absolutely, and we need to absolutely talk about different types of political agents from Halamism. And I think that Halamism has been dangerous. And I use the term Halamism a lot, and I'm very obviously critical of him. And I mean, it was weird because Extinction Rebellion started to have this soul searching like before the pandemic, and basically where his kind of thinking became kind of more and more marginalized, and then he starts these other groups that then become like it, right? Because they're in the media, and when you talk to the people who are involved, well, they think that if they don't get in the media, it doesn't matter, right? So Just Stop Oil was started with blocking oil distribution, and then they realized, oh fuck, we're getting injunctions taken out against us, but nobody gives a shit about what we're doing. We're not ending up in the papers. So then they went back to do things that are going to grab headlines, but to what purpose? That's always a question that why are you doing that? Like, what's the purpose of that media attention? Media attention in itself isn't necessarily good, but they see it as a kind of necessary basis for anything. And it's interesting what you say also, Laurence, and I know which is a critique that you've always had, which is like that there's that when you're done with this kind of protesting, then what comes next is nothing, right? Like it doesn't lead into other things. Looking at them and people that I don't know if that's entirely true. Like looking at activist paths within this, I think a lot of people have been radicalized in many other ways that have been involved with this. But of course, that is also a risk. And when you talk to people who are still at it like that, and you ask them why do you do this? And I get some Just Stop Oil people into like my or not Just Stop Oil, like XR people into my lecture when I talk about these things in the university, and these students ask them, why do you do this? And they just say like, well, I don't really know what else to do. It's like the only thing I can think of. So that obviously speaks to this kind of lack of political imagination in a way that comes with that. But I mean, right now, the political vibe in this country and in a lot of the world is about the genocide, and it's about stopping the genocide and anti-genocide politics. And it's, that's what, and obviously a lot of these climate activists that have been active are also involved with that, or at least show up and so on. And if you go to student campuses, it's the same students. So I mean, that's, I think, where it's important to put efforts into right now, is if you're in the UK, and I imagine in a lot of other countries in the world. And yeah, to stop, I mean, but the creeping criminalization of protest, and there was Louisa, I think you said, it's the coordination. I don't know, the journalists that have studied this right? So like Amy Westervelt, for example, in the US, like she's big on the, yeah, this is coordinated by like the, what do they call the think tank group that they're all part of. It doesn't come to mind right now. But anyway, I mean, in the initial parts of this project, because we've had like a little, I mean, it's not obvious that that's the case. Like it seems, I mean, likely that that's kind of a thing in some countries, but not that they have this mega project of criminalizing protest everywhere all at once in the same way. It seems very, unsurprisingly, countries seem to respond to whatever kinds of protest is going on in their in their countries. But I mean, that's obviously something that I've been involved in for quite some time to highlight this. I mean, I organized this like open letter signed by a bunch of climate academics, when the police crime sentencing and courts bill was just a bill about, protesting the criminalization of climate climate protest specifically, but protests in general. So yeah, but I thank you for all your comments, and this is a good, valuable conversation, because I think it's important to think about what our research gets used as. I mean, one weird place that I was invited to was this what I thought it was a RAND institute to start with, but then I realized, oh no, it's called RAN, so it's called like it's a radicalization awareness network. It's part of the European Commission. They invited me as a speaker first, and I was like, no, I'm not doing that shit. But then they invited me again as to be like in the audience. So I went to this like closed Zoom call, and 80% of the people there were like nice, sound people, from like left to radical-ish left. But then they have these like loony right-wing, hard right academics there that were basically, they were there on the premise that, that extremist groups are using the climate change to forward their evil plans. And yeah, that was a weird experience. And I think, you come into these, and I know that David's had this experience as well of, you have produced research that is basically used by the enemy. And that's obviously a risk that we're in. And I think that you highlight, Louisa, as well, like, to sort of, to not say that it's a logical next step, and for these protests to be violence, and that's therefore we need to. And I think you're referring to one sentence in the paper, that in the Nature paper, and yeah, that was Dana's sentence, not mine. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. But thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in Porto.
Thank you so much for everyone, especially Oscar, Louisa, and Laurence, and especially Bern, that's not here, but he's actually the one that put it all together, but he couldn't make it. So he should be thanked as well. Just to close off, David shared at the very beginning in the chat the link to the Critical Political Economy Research Network mailing list. If you're not on the mailing list, please join. That's the way to find out about these monthly seminars, but he's actually just put it there again. And so you can actually find out about all the activities and everything that the network does, and a lot of other interesting announcements in critical political economy. So make sure that you do join. And thank you, everyone. There's a marvelous sunshine outside, so I'm going to leave now.
There isn't.
Yeah. So take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you soon.
See you
Okay.
soon.